Today I'm going to show you what's inside of the Audi 3.2 V6 engine and how it works. Now this engine is out of a 2012 Audi Q5. See, there's a giant inspection port right inside of the block and the upper oil pan. While some people swear that this engine is pretty reliable, especially for a Volkswagen or Audi, what complicates things more is that the timing chains are located on the back side of the engine, which means that you got to drop this engine down and remove the transmission in order to access some of those timing components, which are not the most reliable. So we're going to tear down this engine to see just what caused it to fail. Taking a quick look around here, the front of the engine is like a normal engine with your accessory drive, water pump up here, plastic idler pulleys over here, and around the side here you'll see we have a plastic valve cover. This does have a separate cam carrier on top of an aluminum head, and then of course an aluminum magnesium block, and then an upper, and then a lower oil pan. And then on the top here we have a plastic intake port, followed by your direct injected fuel rails for your direct injection system, and of course a plastic oil filter housing, which I hate because those leak. Now I'm going to start this tear down by removing this valve cover, but because these Torx bolt heads are so dirty, I'm going to use my wife's toothbrush and just clean them up so they don't strip out. So taking a look under the valve cover, we can see that we got a hydroformed camshaft here with pressed on lobes. Those lobes are then going to press down on these rocker arms underneath here, which in turn are going to press down on the valve. Now I noticed on these we do have two different cam profiles, which means that this has variable valve lift. Next we're going to remove the high pressure fuel pump. Probably going to be fuel everywhere. Got gas all over my foot. My wife's not going to sleep with me tonight. But there's your high pressure fuel pump. There's the roller cam that came out of there. You get the pump housing off. I'm supposed to take out these studs, but clearly the Torx on them has been stripped out. Now I'm going to move towards the taking off this timing cover. So I'm just going to remove this heat shield here. Gives me access to this little pump. Now just remove all the 10mm bolts for the timing cover. Like super clean in there, like brand new, like someone's been in here before. Now this is why this engine is such a stupid design. It's because it lives right up against the firewall here, so working on anything back here is going to be difficult even if you don't want to detach the transmission. Here you can see the timing tensioner. It looks like these guides here on this end are intact, and there's a giant cassette inside of here that holds all this stuff together. And there's a guide up here. These are all made of plastic, which is not a good thing. See if I can knock these trickle square bolts loose for the cams. Ugh. One thing I don't like here is that we've got a lot of interfaces where oil could leak. So obviously there's the big cover at the back here we just pulled off, but there's also this interface over here where the cam cover sits on top of the head itself, and then the head sits on top of the block over here, so you've got another interface here with the bottom timing cover. This has both dual variable valve timing on the intake and the exhaust side, controlled by these two solenoids respectively. I'm going to remove these solenoids next. Next I'm going to remove all these T30s holding the cam caps on. I'm going to break them free first with the ratchet. Here's one intake side, exhaust side. These two are almost like head bolts. It's not one, not two, but three engine hooks on this engine. I'm telling you, this engine was meant to be removed under warranty. Otherwise, they wouldn't have invested so much in putting hooks on. Before I remove this cam cover, I got to remove this high pressure fuel pump where these studs broke off. So I'm going to use my stud removal tool here. There we go. And there you can see the lobe that the high pressure fuel pump was pushing up against. And I can remove this top half of the cam cover. You can see this camshaft's got an interesting design with two different cam lobe profiles, as well as this little track over here. The exhaust cam profile is very simple. Now looking inside this engine, it does look a little bit tarnished. I don't think the previous owner took good care of using the proper oil. So I'm just going to remove these rockers over here. You can see it's got these hydraulic lifters on them, and the good thing is it's got these clips on here to kind of hold the rocker arm on there so that they just don't fall off, unlike some Chrysler Pentastar engines. Now before I remove this passenger side head here, we'll take a minute to take a look at the direct injection system. Here you can clearly see three injectors over here that are going to inject fuel directly down into the combustion chamber, like right next to the spark plug. That's going to give you a better combustion control. However, you don't have that gasoline stream that's blowing down into the back of the valves, which means that you're going to have a lot of carbon buildup inside of here behind the valves. I'm going to go ahead and remove this fuel rail. Now here's one thing I hate. One of these are Torx and the rest of them are 10mm. I don't know why they couldn't use the same fastener for the same part that they're installing. I smell gas. Tiny little T20 in here. There we go. These here are your air intake runners. They're plastic and they bolt up directly to the head, whereas this part here is your fuel rail, which distributes the fuel to the 3 injectors located over here on the head itself. Take a look at that intake, how gummed up it is with carbon. Very common issue on these engines here. Look how much carbon is in here. This one's got a little bit of moisture inside because these runners have been opened, but you can definitely tell how gummed up these are. Now, in order to clean up this, periodically you're going to have to strip down the top of this engine up to this point here and send some abrasive material down in there and suck it up back with a vacuum, and hopefully that'll be enough to loosen up all of those carbon deposits inside of there. If you have all those carbon deposits, it's going to cause your engine to run pretty rough and not very smooth, and that's just a downside to having direct injection down over here as opposed to in the airstream behind it, where the gasoline can act as a cleaner to clean that up naturally. I need to remove this coolant pipe over here. Head bolts on this engine are an M12 triple square. Okay, we're gonna need a longer bar. Stole my wife's old baking pan so I can catch dripping coolant. In order to get this chain out, I'm going to see if I can get this chain cassette thing off. Move this off. So this is basically the tensioner assembly. It's actually hydraulic. Now this chain should just sit there while I pull the head off. Well, it looks like we've got a missing piston inside of this cylinder over here. I can completely see the crankshaft over here, and boy, was this thing really hard to turn over when I was taking off of the flywheel to get the transmission off of this thing. So here you can see is where that piston connecting rod assembly lines up with the hole in the block here. Take a look at that. You can just see like a big chunk of connecting rod or piston down inside of there. And look at the cylinder walls, they're all scored up. This thing must have been running with a blown piston for a little while. Look, a chunk of the block is actually missing up there. Check out the scoring over here on this cylinder. It's so rough, I can feel it right through my wife's toothbrush over here. I also noticed that there's this rusty colored kind of coolant inside of here. So I'm wondering if coolant and oil mix causing this catastrophic failure. Well, I've been staring at this head gasket for a good 10 minutes now, and my wife's probably watching me on the security camera just looking at this thing, contemplating life. Anyways, I don't really see any failure on this. Oh, the story is also pretty catastrophic on the head here. This here is where the injector would be, and you can see it's all smashed up over here and it's all shiny. That means the piston contacted the head over here. Conversely, on this other side here, look at how much carbon is built up on the inside of this combustion chamber. That's not normal or supposed to happen. Also, this is the spark plug that was sitting here. You can see its electrode is completely smashed from whatever happened inside of this combustion chamber. Now, whatever exploded inside of here also took out the personal crankshaft valve, or PCV. See, this entire housing is all busted in here. I'm going to take that off. Alright, so I'm just going to take off a couple of stuff from the top of the engine here to make it a little bit easier to see. A couple of vacuum hoses, I got the fuel line, some wires here for the knock sensor. Yeah, I like that the injector wiring harness is a separate piece. That's good because you can replace it when it breaks, especially being right inside of the hot V of the engine. Look how brittle it is. Oh yeah, oh my goodness, I'm gonna really smell like gas tonight. Just use my wiring harness removal tool to carefully remove all these wires without damaging them. Now, one thing I always dislike on many vehicles is an oil filter housing made of plastic, because they can always crack, leak, and lose oil pressure, or it can also leak at this gasket over here down the back side of the engine. I prefer to keep most pressurized components made out of metal because they have better resistance to heat wear. Now, the PCV system on this engine comprises of this entire piece of black plastic that sits in the middle of the V here. It's basically a giant oil separator. It's going to separate any oil from the crankcase and send the air back into the engine to get burned, and obviously is a huge contributor to all that carbon buildup in the intake valves. And you can see this is the diaphragm, which is what's going to be doing the main separating of the oil. And then there's a whole bunch of baffles inside of here. I just take out all of these bits and pieces that got damaged, and oh my goodness, there's a piece of connecting rod. Look at that. Look at that. Here's a piece of the connecting rod inside of the PCV housing. This is a real catastrophic failure. I'll probably put this on my desk as an ornament. Look, you can actually see the crankshaft down inside of there. PCV systems are not usually supposed to see the crankshaft that easily. I'm also leaking gasoline like crazy here. This thing was probably full. So in order to get this off, I'm going to remove all the T30s going around. And pry this off here. And there's what's left of the PCV system. This thing blasted a huge hole right through the PCV valve system here. There's bits of plastic and stuff coming out from everywhere. Inside of the engine here, you got pieces of metal, chunks of plastic, more plastic. It's just full inside of here. It's like a treasure. And there's a look under the PCV valve inside of the middle valley of this Audi 3.2 engine. You can see it's completely obliterated the block inside of there and the cylinder, which would have been down inside of here. And there's just bits and pieces of metal and plastic everywhere. This is crazy. I wonder what the sump looks like. Alright, next up I'm going to remove this coolant pipe going across the front of the engine here. Hate how they're making coolant stuff out of plastic again. Coolant gets hot, don't use plastic. All these rubber O-rings that sit inside of here are going to leak because the plastic deforms. I'm going to remove the water pump pulley. While I have the socket on there, might as well remove the crank pulley. By the way, without a crank bolt in here, I'm not sure what you're supposed to use to rotate this engine if there's a special tool to get to the flywheel bolts. I just had to use the starter. Alright, next up I'm going to remove this water pump. At least this is pretty easy to access, this being a longitudinally mounted engine. This would be right up against the radiator area. Now that is a proper water pump, unlike the 2-liter engines of the Q5 that have a very faulty water pump. Alright, next I'm going to remove this coolant inlet. Remove this plastic thermostat housing. Here's your plastic thermostat. Now these plastic thermostat housings are not a very strong point in many Audi vehicles. You can see even the housing around here is made of plastic. The only thing that's really made of metal is the return spring in here. Look at this beautifully shaped thermostat housing. It's just the right size. Just loosening the conventional way. There's your tensioner assembly here. And next up I've got this cover here. Now it's not really a timing cover. Yeah, that's the weight for the balance shaft right there. Oh, that was so easy. It's not that heavy. So with the front half of the engine all cleared up here, next I'm going to turn myself to the driver's side here and remove this part of the air intake with the injectors. Here's the air intake runners with the fuel rail. Wonder if Audi gets sponsored by Castrol to put their name on the top of the cap. I'm going to use my wife's toothbrush to scrub the head of these bolts here so they don't get stripped. Now I'm going to remove all the Torx bolts holding the valve cover on the driver's side. Now very similar to the other side, not the best in terms of maintenance, a little bit on the darker side if you ask me. I'm going to remove this heat shield for the secondary air pump. I'm going to remove 2 bolts here and this little air pump thing. Now I'm going to remove the 10s that hold the timing cover on. Very clean inside. Just like the other side, I see the timing chain tensioner is still intact. There's nothing broken inside of here. So I'm going to use this triple square and just knock these guys out. Oh, no! See if I can pry these gears out. Alright, I'm going to remove this timing chain guide assembly here. It doesn't come out. Here's a stupid design. I'm trying to get that 10mm out so we can get the heat shield off. But it's blocked by the oxygen sensor, which means that you got to remove that first. There. I'll just pull off that header. Next I'm going to remove this vacuum pump. Now it's driven off of the intake camshaft over here. It makes those silent but deadly farting sounds. This is also another one of those expensive cars where they got a nice long dipstick tube, but the dipstick is sold separately. That's right, there's a sensor underneath there that you're supposed to use to tell the oil level instead of using a good old dipstick. That could have probably prevented this engine from blowing if the owner was more responsible. Now I'm going to bust all of these T30s free that hold the cam caps on. Probably damage it if you're doing like a valve cover job. I found this little piece of debris here on this head, so I'm wondering if something inside of this head here is also catastrophically failed. We can pull this out. Let me take off the exhaust cam. These don't look really worn out, so I don't know if this engine was really starved of oil or not. And then I'll just take out these little roller arms here. I gotta get this dipstick tube off. Head bolts are M12. Here. This one here is full of oil, this one here is full of coolant, and this cylinder here is full of crust. It's interesting how this piston crown actually passes the level of the head gasket. I'm going to remove this oil cooler over here. Now this was drained of oil, but so far all the coolant that came out of this thing was actually pretty clean and not mixed with any oil. Now it's time to turn the engine on its side, probably make a giant mess here. Now I didn't turn this thing all the way over because there's a lot of piston crumbs inside of there that I want to save. So I'm going to go ahead and remove all of these. Surprisingly, they're 10mm bolts and not stupid Torx or hex or something. Damage in here. Oh, my toe. Need safety shoes for this. Looking inside the oil pan, you can see that we've got a good scar over there. I also found this piston piece inside of here. Looking inside here, you can see the upper oil pan also has got damage up over here, and then you can see right through the block over to the other side. Also inside of the oil pickup tube, check out all of those little crumbs inside of there from when this thing exploded. This was a pretty catastrophic explosion. Next I'm going to remove this oil pump. Now this oil pump is driven by a rod that runs to the timing side of the engine here. Now I'm going to remove this plastic baffle here, which prevents the oil from sloshing around. At least this didn't even get damaged. I was able to free that off of the oil pump drive over there. Check out all the gunk inside of that pickup tube. Now I'm going to remove all the 10mm bolts that hold this upper oil pan on. You can really see this entire chunk that's missing, especially from this plastic baffle that's down here. Look at all that damage inside of the block. It just chewed a line right through the block there. What stopped right here at the gasket surface. Even the crankshaft got chewed up over here as well. Looks like the counterweight for the other piston also got chewed up with all the debris that was rotating around here. This here is the drive shaft that gets powered by the timing chain, which is back here for the oil pump. Now we have yet another socket type. These connecting rod caps are E-Torx 10mm. I'm going to break them free. This thing definitely starved of oil, and these ones came out of the back two pistons over here. I'm going to try to remove these pistons kindly. There's one of them. Here's the other one. Now this thing does not have a crank bolt, so I'm going to have to be a little creative in how I rotate this engine, because I need to access the other connecting rods. I noticed this one doesn't even have a bearing in it, so I'm guessing this one spun a bearing. It was tight despite having no bearing in there. See if I can beat this out. Here's the bearing that came out of it. Rotate this engine some more. Alright, now we're going to get these last two connecting rod bearings. Looks like these piston tops came in contact with the head, because you can see it's completely clean here and the rest of it is all carbed up. And you can see the piston skirts are really worn up. I can feel that right through my toothbrush. This thing has definitely starved of oil. Of course it has these low tension rings that don't really have a gap in them for the oil to go back down, but that's part of a design issue. Now the crank bearing caps are actually integrated into this upper oil pan, you can say, or lower block piece, which forms one big structure, which is good for the bottom end strength. These are 12-point 10mm bolts I'm going to remove. Now I'm going to zip these off. Next up, I'm going to remove all these triple squares going around the perimeter here that hold this upper oil pan to the block. I'll remove these bolts. I wonder if I can tap out this. Oh yay, there's your plastic dipstick tube. That's really useless because there's no dipstick in it. Because the timing cover is located on the back side, a lot of these gears are mounted to this upper oil pan, so I'm going to have to pull this off of the stand and take the rest apart down below. I already took out the bolts for the timing cover before I put it on the stand. And we can pop off the timing cover. And here we have the mess of timing chains that are in behind the Audi 3.2 liter V6 engine. There are 4 chains in the system. You can see these 2 chains here are the ones that go to the respective heads here on the driver and passenger side. I'll just remove those. Those power the camshafts. And of course you've got their intermediary gears that are powered by this main chain over here that goes to the crankshaft, and it's got its own tensioner assembly over here. Now on top of all of that, we've got this assembly here, which is the balancer shaft, and then it's also got its tensioner mechanism over here, and then additionally it powers this gear over here, which has the drive shaft that leads down to the oil pump. Quite a lot of complexity for just a simple V6 engine, which is multiplied by the fact that this is located at the transmission side. So if you got to do any service, you're gonna have to remove the transmission to get to any of these guides or tensioners when they do eventually blow. Now this intermediary gear here has got a triple square on it, but it's kind of off-centered, while the other side gear has 3 little Torxes on it that hold it on, and they do the same thing. They're both the intermediate gears that take it to the camshaft. Alright, I'm going to knock these loose first. There we go. This off here. Remove that, and the oil pump drive shaft popped off. And I'm going to remove the secondary drive over here. One large cassette. Now this tensioner is just spring loaded, which is great. I like this because they're not going to fail as often. But what I don't like is that all these slides here are all made of plastic. The chain is nice and thick though. The entire slider here is all made of plastic, but they are using a hydraulic and spring loaded tensioner with the oil feed over here. Now I can release this chain over here, and I can pop off this guy and remove the main chain. The slides are all plastic. Look how easy it is to break this. It's actually pretty flexible. But this one's backed by die-cast metal. Same thing with this one. It's back with die cast metal, which is great. Gonna remove this flange that held on the oil pump gear. You can see that had an oil passage inside of there to lubricate this bearing surface that was in here. There's a lot of pieces of debris inside of here. To remove this balancer bolt. Remove this plate. Looks like it was hiding an oil passage back there. I'm going to give this oil pan a tap here. And then I can take off the crankshaft and move the block off to this side for the next segment. So now that we've disassembled the engine, let's take a closer look at some of the components that make this work, starting here with the crankshaft. Now at the front is where your harmonic balancer will bolt up to, and at the back here you've got the two gears for the camshaft and oil pump drive. Now this engine suffered major catastrophic damage through the starvation of oil around this bearing region over here. You can see it is completely mangled up. There's actually pieces of bearing on here that I can't even peel off. Now this kind of failure happens when there's major oil starvation. So for example, this bearing here wants to turn, but there's so much heat and friction that's built up inside of this engine, it completely seizes up. Once this seizes up, well, something's gonna have to give, and boom, there goes your connecting rod straight through a hole in the block. Now the main rod bearings didn't suffer too much damage. It was mostly a connecting rod thing, and that's because the oil is usually fed first to the main bearing, and then the connecting rod tees off of that in order to get the oil. So it's basically the last thing in the line to get the oil. So if there's any starvation issues, that one's gonna die first. Now one thing you'll notice is the connecting rods don't share the same journal the way like an i6 or a V8 would, and that's why they have to be offsetted, because this is a 90-degree V6, not a 60-degree V6 like you'd normally see on other engines. So you have to phase these apart in order for them to balance itself properly. Now the beginning of the lubrication system starts in the oil pan, where we have this oil pickup tube here, which, as I've mentioned before, is full of a whole bunch of junk inside of there from the failure, which means that this engine didn't just fail, it actually drove this engine after it failed, allowing it to suck up all of that crap. See if I can take this oil pump apart and see what's inside. Now this is a variable oil pump, so when your RPMs are a little bit too high, it's going to squeeze against that spring over there, and you're going to see it's going to change the effective volume of these little compartments inside of the vanes here, providing a different fluid flow. Now if I pop this off here, you can see here's the oil pump housing, and here is the part here with the vanes. These are the little vanes. This thing's definitely had some debris going through here. You can see the oil has a little bit of a sparkle to it. Moreover, you can see some of it is actually deposited on the bottom here. Oil from the pump is then going to be sent through this hole over here in the upper oil pan, where the oil cooler mounts to. It's going to then cool off and then sent back down over this way to the backside over here, where it's going to go into the upper oil pan. See, there's a lot of chunks and a lot of damage from when that connecting rod blew right through. All here it's damaged. Now a lot of that oil is then going to be sent straight from the bottom over here to the top, directly into the block. And here we come to the engine block on this 3.2 engine. Here you could see that unfiltered oil is then going to be sent through this oil gallery down to a main oil gallery that goes down the middle over here on the left side. Look at all that damage. Then over here, where it's completely blown a hole right through everything, and then continuing over here on the left side to the back. Now following up that left side, you can see this here is where the oil filter is going to mount to. It's then going to filter out the oil and then send it back through down this hole over here, back down towards the main bearing. And finally, back in the middle of the V here, you can see the oil gallery where these sprayers are going to tap off of. This sprayer is in the right spot, but you can see this one's all bent out of shape. Moving over here, the sprayers don't really exist anymore, but you could see where that oil gallery used to be, over here on the left side. And then finally over here, you can see this one here is all mangled up, but this one is definitely spraying the cylinder walls. So you can see the main flaw here is you're sending unfiltered oil through the cooler, through many parts of the engine, through these little oil galleries, and filtering it out all the way at the top of the back of the engine before bringing it into the main bearings. I think that's a pretty bad flaw. They should probably keep the filter close to where the oil pump is. You kind of prevent a lot of that crap flowing through the oil from reaching all of these main bearings. Sorry, I'm gonna have to call Audi out on this one, because they don't even include a proper dipstick tube for you to check it yourself. You gotta go through who knows what menu in order to get the oil level from the sensor over here. And in addition to that, they make the oil run through half of the engine before you can actually filter it out. Like, I know the 3.2 engine is supposed to be the reliable engines. You're really asking for failure when you're not designing any characteristics into this to be tolerable to low oil pressure or the lack of low oil. You can't be relying on this little sensor to tell you something's wrong on the dashboard, because when this comes on, it's often too late, and the people who drive Q5s don't really know how to read very well either. Now, teeing off of the main oil gallery, you have these ones here that go to the head respectively so that they can get lubricated and to feed the variable valve timing system. You've also got one that comes over here for the timing chain tensioner, and then one over here for the oil pump bearing. Now looking across the top of the block here, you can see that's the cylinder that blew, and boy did it blow. It blew a cylinder liner, it blew a hole in the top and the bottom and the side, This is probably a higher RPM failure if you ask me. Now we talked earlier about the PCV system. Essentially what this does is it's going to take crankcase pressure generated by the pistons moving up and down and send it through that diaphragm that used to be missing over there and a bunch of the baffles inside here before sending it out into your intake to cause carbon buildup. And while we're on the block, we're going to talk about the pistons, or at least what's left of them. You can see on this piston here at the top there's a lot of carbon buildup. It's kind of like a sludge sort of buildup, but on this side here you can see it's completely clean, and that's likely where it contacted the top of the head. Now what I've got an issue with is really the lower ring over here, which is your oil control ring. Now these two top rings over here are the compression ring, but this oil control ring is of those low tension type. You can see here it's like completely blocked up, which means that as this piston's moving down, it's going to try to scrape oil, but there's not much room for that oil to escape back down the inside of the piston, and it's going to end up burning oil. And obviously when you burn oil, eventually you're going to end up with no oil and starve the engine of oil, which is probably what happened in this case. Here's another normal piston. You can see it's got a corrugated section inside of here, which gives it a lot of room for oil to seep inside of there and flow back through the piston over here, so this won't burn as much oil. Now while the cooling system is somewhat simple, there isn't a lot of robustness built into some of the components. For example, the water pump is going to sit up at the front here, nice and simple, and then it's going to cross over to this side over here where we have the thermostat that sits over here. That's going to allow coolant from the water pump to spread over to the back side of the block over here to cool off the block itself. Now the block itself is actually pretty strongly built, although in this case it didn't really survive. That's because it has a closed deck design here, which means that these areas in between the cooling jackets here are filled in. Not that good for cooling, supposedly better to keep these cylinder walls intact. The use of plastic on these cooling components is abundant. See, even this thermostat is made of plastic here. Now that's because these things heat cycle a lot and they can cause leakage as they warp over time. Now taking a look at the bottom of the cylinder head here, you can see that theme with the closed deck design kind of continued. The cooling jackets around this head is actually pretty small. They're not very deep. You can see around here it's completely shallow. There's actually not really much of a cooling jacket here. Now this engine does have direct injection, which is where you can see this little port over here, which is going to directly squirt fuel down into this combustion palace over here next to the spark plug. That's great because you can control the combustion better and supposedly emissions and have more power. However, you will have that carbon buildup issue. On this side here you can see that the heads are somewhat clean, not so much carbon, especially when you compare it over here to this side. And as I pull out this piece here, check out the wear from the chains on this one. Now these chain tensioners are also oil powered. Now the top end of this engine actually stayed pretty clean. There's not much damage inside of the cam cap bearings. While there is a bit of tarnishing from the lack of oil changes, overall it's actually in pretty good shape. Now here you can see the oil feed where the block is going to feed the head with oil. That oil is then going to make its way to these two oil galleys over here. Now those two oil galleys are then going to run the length of the head here, and you can see those holes where these hydraulic lifters are going to live. The oil pressure is just going to push up on this rocker, and that's what's going to push down on the valve, so you don't have any lash between the cam, which is rolling around on these needle bearings, and the lifter. Here's a look underneath the head here from when the piston let go and it smacked the head. It damaged it pretty good and mushroomed everything. Sitting on top of the head is this cam cradle. It's going to take oil from over here and bring it to the two solenoids that used to sit here to power the variable valve timing system on the intake and exhaust side. However, what's most intriguing is the variable valve lift system, where we have these solenoids which have these little plungers on them that are going to kick out when activated. So here's the camshaft, and you'll see that we've got this little track here where the plunger is going to engage into, and when it does engage, it's going to shift from this side over to the other side. So essentially this entire thing here is going to move from one side to the other. We have two cam profiles, one on this side and one on this side. Of course, the taller one is going to open the valve more to allow more air in at higher RPMs, and then the smaller one is just going to be when you're idling or driving around town. Now, in order to select which one you want, you just have to activate these solenoids, which are going to follow this little path in here, and that's going to shove this over back to the one you want. Depending on where you've shifted this little roller wheel here is either going to follow the small lobe or the larger lobe for more lift. It's pretty clear that the valves on the damaged cylinder are bent. You can see right through them. And that's a look at the Audi 3.2 engine and how it works. Now, if you don't want this to happen to you, make sure you check your oil and check it often. Also, make sure you subscribe if you want to see more videos just like this one. Now, if you are the engineer that designed this fake dipstick, I'd like to have a talk with you, because it's responsible for many of the engine failures that you see on this channel.